So most countries in the world have normal, traditional bilateral relations with China. They're not necessarily how do you say pro-China, but they're certainly not anti-China. They see China as a reality that we have to live with. One thing that Americans should do is travel around the world and see how the rest of the world views China. And they'll be surprised to discover that almost no other country shares this incredibly negative view of China that the Americans have developed of China. And Americans have isolated themselves from the rest of the world.
Why does Professor Kishore Mahbubani say the U.S. is getting China all wrong? In this compelling interview, he breaks down the flaws in America's containment approach and what it means for global power dynamics. Watch now for a fresh perspective.
By far, the most sophisticated geopolitical players in the world are the Chinese leaders. By far. Because they're not thinking about just tomorrow. They're always thinking of where they are headed for in the next 5 to 10 years. So they are always thinking where they want to be 10 years from now. And then they carry out various measures to ensure that they head in that direction. So, for example, many years ago, they anticipated some kind of containment policy by the United States. And so they went out of their way to integrate themselves with the countries surrounding them. So, for example, I live in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN. Can you believe it? In the year 2001, China proposed a free trade agreement with ASEAN. In fact, even though ASEAN is a pro-Western organization, no Western country proposed a free trade agreement, but China did so. And the result of that was that China's trade with ASEAN, Southeast Asia, went up from 40 billion in the year 2000 to 975 billion by 2022, making it the world's largest trading relationship. That's an example of long-term thinking that paid off. And in the same way, all these initiatives that the Chinese have launched, the Belt and Road Initiative, the New Development Bank Initiative, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank Initiative, these are all initiatives that are tying the world to China in many ways substantively. And so they knew that if a very difficult American president came along, they had to make sure that they had substantive ties with the rest of the world to protect themselves from such an American president. So, and of course, in the case of Donald Trump, they have very complex cost-benefit calculations. They know that Trump will apply a lot of bilateral pressure on China, but at the same time, Trump will also alienate lots of the allies of the United States of America because he sees allies not as assets, but as liabilities. So all the efforts by the Biden administration to try and get the Asian allies to counterbalance China will be washed away to some extent by Donald Trump. So we know that costs and benefits for the Chinese when Donald Trump takes over. Well, one thing I want to say, another startling thing for your American audience, which they should be aware of, is that there are 8 billion people on planet Earth. And the United States only represents 330 million people. The 330 million people in the United States of America have been captured by a very negative portrayal of China, and believe that China is out to dominate the world and China is a threat to the world. And, one thing that Americans should do is travel around the world and see how the rest of the world views China. And they'll be surprised to discover that almost no other country shares this incredibly negative view of China that the Americans have developed of China. And Americans have isolated themselves from the rest of the world with their characterizations of China. Because if you look around the world substantively, most countries in the world are stepping up their links with China. I think it is, by the way, when you live next to a country that used to be a mouse, small mouse, and remember in the year 1980, the U.S. economy was 10 times the size of China. Now it's only 1.5 times bigger. So in the region, the elephant has become a mouse. So the mouse has become an elephant. And trust me, of course, every neighbor of China is concerned about China's rise. But the question is, how do you manage China's rise? And the United States has decided to demonize China and put China completely in the negative ledger. But you will find that countries, all the neighbors, including Japan and India, have actually stepped up their trade links with China. And India and China, as you know, have had a very bad relationship since June 2020, but they have now to try to normalize their relations with China. So most countries in the world have normal, traditional bilateral relations with China. They're not necessarily how do you say pro-China, but they're certainly not anti-China. They see China as a reality that we have to live with. So the American perception of China is not shared by the vast majority of the world's population. And I'm surprised how few Americans are aware of this huge reality that Americans have isolated themselves with their demonization of China. Certainly, the liberal Americans had some very unrealistic expectations of China. I mean, when they believed that if China integrated itself with the world economically, it would then become a carbon copy of American liberal democracy. Now, that was a bizarre hope because, China is the world's oldest continuous civilization. It's 4,000 years old or plus 4,000 years old. And the idea that a 4,000-year-old civilization would model its political future on a young baby, a 250 and a less than 250-year-old republic called the United States of America, that was an incredibly arrogant, naive hope that Americans had about China. And of course, this arrogant, naive hope has been shattered because China would never have become a carbon copy of the United States of America. And here, if you want me to make another provocative point, it's a huge mistake that Americans are making to demonize Xi Jinping, the person, because the Xi Jinping, by the way, just so that everyone in the United States knows, is treated with great respect by most leaders in the world. When you watch him in his interactions with other leaders in the world, they realize he's one of the more competent leaders of the world. He's growing his economy. China is going through a bad patch, by the way. The Chinese economy is going through a bad patch this year and next year. It'll take some time to recover. But overall, it's still going to grow by 5%. And if you look at the real economy of China, the real economy of China is investing in the industries of the future to a far greater extent than any other leading economy in the world, whether it's in electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, um, batteries, everything. China's investing in the future. So I think it's better to treat China as, frankly, as a serious competitor and not demonize it either way. Even if you look at American companies today, ask yourself, how much would Apple be worth if Apple could not produce its phones in China? How much would Tesla be worth if it could not produce its cars in China? I mean, it's important to do take a realistic view of how dependent the American economy is in real terms on the manufacturing of components in China, because the Chinese have created an amazing manufacturing ecosystem, the best one in the world. And I'm sure you've heard of Adam Tooze, this British Columbia University. And, he just gave a lecture recently in Zurich where he said, the first China shock was the one you mentioned, when China suddenly introduced lots of new manpower into the global manufacturing system. And it is a fact that many workers in the United States and Europe lost their jobs. And frankly, what they should have been provided with should have been worker retraining assistance, but they were not, sadly. And that's one reason why they lost their jobs. But he's now saying there's a second China shock that's coming, where the only way for the advanced Western economies to develop is now to copy China, because China is ahead in manufacturing. Now, can you believe it? That you used to be worried about the Chinese stealing intellectual property, stealing, intellectual property assets from the West. Now the West, he says, will have to copy Chinese intellectual property if it's going to succeed and grow in the coming decades. That's how much the world has changed. And this is why my goal is to give my American friends a more realistic view of the world that we have today, rather than the mythical view that dominates the description, the portrayals of China in the American liberal media.